All right, today we're diving into a document that makes some, well, absolutely extraordinary claims. On October 8th, 2025, a group calling itself the Alliance of Indigenous Nations International Tribunal put out a formal declaration. And what it has to say is, well, it's a bombshell. So let's get right into it.
And boom, there it is, right at the top, no beating around the bush. The declaration flat out states that in its view, these injections are biological and technological weapons of mass destruction. I mean, that is a stunning claim. So how in the world do they build a case for that? Let's unpack their argument.
Okay, here's our roadmap. We're going to tackle this in 5 parts. We'll start with the declaration itself. Then we'll look at how this tribunal claims to have the authority to even say this. After that, we'll dig into the evidence they present, first from expert testimony and then from their scientific claims. And finally, we'll look at their big conclusion and what they're calling for. So first up, the declaration. The whole point of this document, its entire reason for being, is to legally reclassify these injections. They want to move them out of the medicine category and squarely into the bioweapon category. This, of course, brings up the most obvious question, right? Who is this tribunal? And on what grounds? What authority do they think they can make such a massive declaration?
Well, before they get to a single piece of scientific evidence, they spend a lot of time laying out their legal case for their own existence. And this is a really crucial step for them. They're trying to establish that they aren't just a protest group with a strong opinion, but a legitimate judicial body with the power to make these kinds of legal findings.
To do that, they pull from all over the place. Indigenous common law, UN declarations, international covenants, the whole shebang. But the real linchpin of their argument seems to be this correspondence they say they had in December 2024. They claim it shows Canada's Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations actually recognized the tribunal on a nation-to-nation basis. That's the cornerstone of their claim to sovereignty. Okay, so once they've established in their view that they have the legal right to do this, they move on to their first big pillar of evidence. And that's the opinion of an expert who they say is the actual architect of America's bioweapons law. And that expert's name is Dr. Francis Boyle. The tribunal makes a point of laying out his credentials to position him as a major authority. The key detail here, the reason they lean on him so heavily, is their claim that he didn't just study the law. He actually drafted the U.S. Biological Weapons Act they're basing their entire argument on. And this is his bottom line, according to the tribunal. They quote Dr. Boyle calling the injections an offensive biological warfare weapon, and then they say, "We agree." They explicitly adopt his conclusion as their own. So you can see how much of their legal classification is really resting on this one expert's opinion. Okay, so from that legal definition, the document pivots hard into the science. And these claims rely heavily on another expert, Dr. Ana Maria Mijosia, along with a number of studies she references. To try and show just how widespread this issue is, they point to this Italian study of over 1,000 vaccinated patients. And the claim is pretty shocking, that in 94% of them, researchers using a dark field microscope found what they call self-assembly nanotechnology structures in their blood. So what are these structures? The document calls them hydrogel polymers. It describes them as a substance that's created by the lipid nanoparticles in the injections. The allegation is that this stuff can build itself, spread through the body, and form these strange, rubbery, plastic-like clots. The testimony they cite lays out this whole step-by-step process. It supposedly starts with these things called quantum dots clumping together into little spheres. Then those spheres break open, releasing these ribbon-like filaments. That's the hydrogel. And the final step they claim is that this hydrogel just keeps growing, forming clots that are almost impossible to destroy. And this is where the document takes a huge leap. It uses this quote from Dr. Mijosia to connect these physical things, these hydrogels, to the massive philosophical idea of transhumanism. Her claim is that this process is literally replacing natural blood cells with a synthetic material. So let's be really clear about how the document defines transhumanism. They're not talking about some sci-fi future. They define it as a process happening right now where people are being turned into, and these are their words, transhumans, without their knowledge, without their consent, as these synthetic materials supposedly take over. Now, beyond the hydrogels, the declaration lists a bunch of other very serious claims. It alleges the injections are contaminated with bacterial DNA, or plasmids, and something called an SV40 promoter, which it links to cancer. And from there, it lists a whole cascade of severe health problems and even cites one global study that it says estimates about 17 million deaths worldwide. The document also has a whole section dedicated to alleged harms during pregnancy. Citing its sources, it lists a range of awful adverse events, from miscarriage and fetal death to developmental abnormalities, all of which it claims are linked to the injections. So, in its final section, the tribunal zooms out. It takes all these specific allegations and tries to connect them to a much wider political context before it delivers its final judgment. The argument here is that this didn't just happen in a vacuum. The tribunal tries to connect it to a U.S. national security memo from all the way back in 1974 that dealt with depopulation. They also allege that the whole thing was only possible because of a massive, system-wide censorship campaign. And finally, they frame it as a modern act of colonialism aimed specifically at indigenous peoples. And all of this, it all builds to their ultimate and, let's face it, their grievous conclusion. They find that when you combine everything, the gene editing claims, the nanotechnology, the alleged harms, and the political context, what you're left with is a planned genocide and a crime against humanity. So that's what we're left with. This declaration is one group's highly structured attempt to completely reframe a global health campaign as something else entirely. The question it leaves hanging in the air isn't so much whether its claims are true, but in the world we live in today, what kind of power does a declaration like this actually have?